All right, we're back on the record on CR 2221-1623, State of Idaho versus Chad Daybell. The defense concluded with its closing argument. At this time, the state is permitted a rebuttal closing argument. Is that going to be you again, Ms. Blake? All right, Ms. Blake, then if you'd like to have the state's rebuttal argument, you can do so now.
Thank you, Your Honor. May I please have use of the HDMI?
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, counsel talked to you about some jury instructions, and I want to talk to you a little bit about them as well. You are going to get the official jury instructions from the judge, and in fact, you've already received those. As counsel talked about during jury selection, we also talked about jury instructions, and we talked about that that's what you would agree to follow in this case. I want to go over a couple of those with you. Instruction number 18. Counsel went over that with you, but I want to go through it again briefly. Aiding and abetting is defined as before or during the commission, intentionally aiding, assisting, facilitating, promoting, encouraging, counseling, soliciting, inviting, helping, or hiring another to commit a crime with the intent to promote or assist in its commission. If you find any one of those acts occurred, any one of those things, again, when we're talking about principal to first-degree murder, when we are talking about conspiracy, you don't have to find that the defendant actually committed the physical act to end someone's life. You have to find that he did one of those other things that we just talked about. When we talk about reasonable doubt, again, you have a jury instruction. However, reasonable doubt is commonly defined as a doubt that would cause a reasonable person to hesitate to act. Emphasis on reasonable. It's not any doubt. It is not a mere possible or imaginary doubt. It is a doubt based on reason and common sense. And again, you have that jury instruction. The state absolutely recognizes we have the burden of proof in this case. We told you that from the beginning. We're not shying away from that. It is our burden. And the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt. And again, that's not a mere possible or imaginary doubt. It's based on common sense. I also want to talk to you a little bit about the conspiracy instruction. You have several of those. In this case, we have 3 counts of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. When you look at that conspiracy instruction, at the very bottom, it'll say that you have to find each and every element. What I want to distinguish, because I think it can get a little confusing at times, is one of the elements says that you have to find one overt act. You don't have to find every overt act. You have to find every element. And I think it's number 6 within that instruction that will list out the overt acts. And again, for a conspiracy, it requires that there be a plan to commit a crime, and then that just one of the actors commit one overt act. Not every actor has to commit one. Not every overt act has to be committed. Which brings us to jury instruction number 20. And counsel talked to you about this when it comes to an agreement. And I would highlight that in instruction number 20, criminal conspiracy is defined as 2 or more persons combining or conspiring to commit any crime or offense prescribed by the laws of the state of Idaho. And 1 or more of such persons does any act to affect the object of the combination or conspiracy. Conspirators need not agree upon every detail. The agreement may be established in any manner sufficient to show an understanding of the parties. It may be shown by evidence of an oral or written agreement, or it may be implied from the conduct of parties. I think that's important here. Counsel talked to you and kept trying to highlight and say, there's no agreement in the text messages. There's no agreement saying we're going to kill anyone. I would disagree with that. And we're going to go through some text messages again. However, there doesn't have to be a written agreement. Again, it can be implied. So I'd ask you to keep that in mind. And when you go back to deliberate, really look at those jury instructions. As counsel said, it is the judge that controls the instructions. It is the judge that controls the law in the courtroom. Counsel talked to you about Emma Murray and the wind searches. We also talked about the wind searches. It's a listed overt act. On September 8th of 2019, Chad Daybell's Gmail email address was searching southwest wind. It was the day before Tylee Ryan is believed to have been taken to Chad Daybell's property. And if you recall, I asked Emma about that she just happened to do it the same day Tylee went missing. But what I'd also ask you to remember is Emma Murray talked to you all about how she wanted to see her mom's autopsy results. And she told you how law enforcement threatened her. You can't see it unless you sit down for an interview. And I'd ask you to remember when Detective Mattingly came in and we played a recording. The recording was a depiction of the interaction between Detective Mattingly and Emma Murray. And I'd ask you to remember that in that interaction, Detective Mattingly specifically tells Emma, I just want to share the autopsy results with you. I think you're entitled to see them. I'm not saying what he said verbatim. It's an exhibit if you want to listen to it. But he was very clear with Emma. He wasn't trying to interview her. He told her, you don't need to sit down for an interview. And yet when Emma was on the stand, she said the only way she could see those autopsy results was if she sat down for an interview. That's not what the recording showed. And I'd ask you to keep in mind too, Jason William came and testified. And one of the things Jason talked about is that he and Chad had been friends. Jason is married to Tammy's sister. Jason indicated Chad made a statement to him along the lines of, my kids know how to keep a secret. Counsel talked to you about Charles Vallow. And he talked about that charges are not being pursued against Charles Vallow. But if you recall, what Detective Duncan said is law enforcement absolutely recommended charges. And what Detective Duncan said is that homicides are never a closed deal. Counsel wants you to believe that there was evidence presented that Tylee witnessed or saw what happened to Charles. You rely on your recollections. What you all saw and heard and what you recall is what you consider in this case. Arguments of counsel are not evidence. But I would indicate I don't recall hearing that. I don't think there's any evidence whether Tylee actually witnessed the homicide of Charles Vallow. But what I would ask you to consider is what we do know. Because counsel also brought up Brandon Boudreaux and brought up Chad doesn't have charges pending for Brandon Boudreaux. He does not. Chad's not here on trial for the death of Charles Vallow or Brandon Boudreaux. But keep in mind what we know. Chad Daybell labeled Brandon Boudreaux dark. Alex Cox went down to Arizona in Tylee's Jeep after Tylee was already gone and took a shot at Brandon Boudreaux. Chad labels people dark. Chad determines death percentages or when someone's time is up. And Alex believes Chad 100%. Alex does what Chad asks of him. What do we also know? Chad labeled Charles dark. In fact, 3 different entities were named by Chad as having taken over Charles. And keep in mind the facts that we do know. On June 29th of 2019, Charles confronted Lori about the affair. On July 1st of 2019, Charles said, "I'm going to go and meet with Tammy. She deserves to know." And 10 days later, Charles is dead. Alex shot and killed him. Chad was on the phone with Lori, texting just before Charles arrived. Chad was on the phone with Lori throughout the day, and Chad called the mortuary about how to get Charles cremated and sent to Louisiana. Lori and Alex weren't the ones labeling people dark in the messages. Lori and Alex weren't the ones assigning death percentages. And you saw the message from Lori telling Alex, she and Chad were trying to figure out how to fully get rid of zombies, and then they would let Charles know, or Alex know. Alex wasn't the one making those determinations. Chad was. And when it came to Tylee, also remember Alice Gilbert said Chad told her, "Tylee didn't like me." Counsel talked to you about Regan Price hearing a gunshot. And again, you go off your recollection and your understanding of the testimony. I don't know, I don't recall Regan saying a specific date or time. But what I would indicate is counsel says, well, he shot a raccoon on the morning of September 9th. I would remind you, we don't know the cause of death for Tylee Ryan because she was burned. We do know, and we saw the slide, that Alex Cox, or a device associated with him, was on the Daybell property the morning after Tylee was last seen alive. And we saw the location data, it doesn't just put him on Chad's property, it puts him by where Tylee's body was found. It puts him by the pet cemetery, by the burn pit. Chad sends a message that morning around the same time about burning limbs and debris. But he wants you to believe that somehow Tylee's body was buried somewhere else. Alex just happened to be up there that day at the same time in the same place that Tylee's body was ultimately found, but she must have been moved. Alex went to the apartment where Tylee was staying. Alex received a phone call from Chad, and Alex went to Chad's property on September 9th of 2019. There was talk about these tools and looking at the exhibits, and I encourage all of you to look at any exhibits that you want to. You're the finders of fact. They are there for your review. But what I would remind you is Agent Daniels was asked about those tools. And he kept saying and indicated he didn't see what dirt or what counsel was talking about when being asked questions about the dirt on those handles. Agent Daniels was very clear about how they ran that search scene. He was very clear about partitioning things off. And you heard from multiple officers about the intricacies of that body recovery, about how many agencies and investigators were involved. There was no evidence, no testimony that anyone on scene took those tools and used them. In fact, it was the opposite. There was no testimony, no indication that any investigator went and took tools out of Chad Daybell's property to dig up those kids. I'd also remind you, Agent Daniels was very clear about Chad Daybell's house having an upstairs. He was asked about that several times. He was very clear. There was an upstairs. And I remind you, on June 9th, there was an audio recording played of Chad and Emma talking. And there was an indication of Chad saying, "You can go ahead and take the mattress out of the upstairs." Again, on January 23rd, Chad places a call to Alex. Alex then goes to Chad's property. And we see a device or Alex at the Daybell property on the morning of September 23rd, the day after JJ's last seen alive. And he's not just on the property, he is where JJ is found. He gets a call from Chad and he goes up there. Counsel talked to you about Melanie Gibb and David Warwick being there the last time JJ's seen alive. I would remind you, you heard from Agent Hart and you heard how he went through Lori's iCloud accounts, and there were thousands of messages, a lot of data, a lot of information. And what didn't he find? He didn't find messages from Melanie Gibb saying Tylee and JJ were dark or that Tammy was dark. He didn't find messages from Melanie Gibb saying what anyone's death percentage was. He didn't find messages from Melanie Gibb or David Warwick indicating anything like that. He didn't find messages from Melanie Gibb or David Warwick to Lori about any type of a plan. Melanie and David both testified. They left the morning of the 23rd. They did not go to the Daybell property. In fact, if you recall, David testified he wanted to see JJ again. Lori didn't let him. In addition, if you recall, Ian Pulowski had made some recordings at the request of law enforcement. He was trying to help law enforcement locate the kids. In those recordings, there's several times where Chad and Lori are on the recording with Melanie and Ian. In one of the calls, Alex and Zulema are present as well. And in that call, they talk about Melanie Gibb. They're upset with her. Why are they upset with her? Because she's going to go to the police and tell them the truth. And Lori's own words, 3 things are going to happen. She's going to basically pay for it in the afterlife because she has knowledge. She's out of our group. And the cops aren't going to believe her now that she's telling the truth. What's key there? She's telling the truth. And what was Melanie Gibb's truth? She never had the kids. Counsel talked to you about Lori making a comment about going to live with Melanie Gibb. That comment would have been made on November 26th of 2019 when Rexburg law enforcement responded to the apartment trying to do a welfare check on JJ Vallow. Remember, at that time, Melanie Gibb had been told that JJ was with Kay by Lori. When Chad called her that day, she asked him, Kay doesn't have JJ? And Chad said no. Chad knew JJ wasn't with Kay. There was no indication that Lori had any plans to move with Melanie. And in fact, at that point, JJ and Tylee were gone. Where did Lori actually go? She didn't go to Melanie's. She went to Hawaii with Chad. And in fact, with both Tylee and JJ, both of them were last seen shortly after it was confirmed that Lori was receiving their Social Security payments. Chad is the one who determined if someone was dark. Chad is the one who determined death percentages. The kids were buried on Chad's property. Chad called Alex both mornings before Alex showed up. Counsel also talked to you about the fact Alex is not shy about shooting people. Counsel talked to you about he shot Charles Vallow. He shot at Brandon Boudreaux. But remember, on October 9th, when there's the attempted shooting of Tammy, Alex had gone and purchased dark clothing, including a dark face mask. Alex had a Grendel 6.5. Remember Tammy's description. The man stood there looking at me, just pulling the trigger, just shooting at me. This wasn't someone that mistook Tammy for Chad. And you heard testimony from Garth Daybell. And first, Garth said at the time of the attempted shooting, Tammy was the one driving the Dodge. And upon a little further questioning from counsel, he switched that. At a minimum, what stayed consistent with the testimony was Tammy did in fact use that Dodge. Tammy was the one confronted by a gunman. Tammy was the one that had someone standing there pulling a trigger at her, not Chad. In fact, you heard testimony, there was no report by Chad ever made, at least to the Fremont County Sheriff's Office, about anyone attempting to harm him. No report made that he was concerned or had any fear of Alex Cox. In fact, after Alex shot and killed Charles Vallow in July, Chad was back down there visiting with Alex and Lori first part of August. And during that visit, that's when he gave Alex a blessing that Alex should move to Idaho. Doesn't sound scared of Alex. And we talk about some of the things Chad told people. And we'd heard a little bit of a conversation that he had with Jason William. And I think on that call, we had it as December 18th of 18, and that actually would have been December 18th of 2019. So you knew Gibb placed a call on December 8th of 2019 to Chad and Lori tells her JJ's safe. And on December 18th of 2019, they have a conversation with Jason William. And in that conversation, Chad tells him, it's just a simple situation. Chad was with Lori when she talked to Gibb. Lori was with Chad when they talked to Jason. A simple situation. Know where JJ is. You heard also from Emma Murray that her dad told her the kids were safe and it would all be explained or cleared up in due time. What you never hear is Chad reporting anything to law enforcement about these kids being missing, never reporting anything to law enforcement about fear of Lori Vallow or Alex Cox. What we do see is continued phone contact between them. We hear of continued interactions in person between those individuals. And we hear repeatedly how Alex and Chad have a close relationship. Melanie Pulowski said Alex looked to Chad like a big brother, would do what he asked. And then counsel also talked to you about Tammy's autopsy. And he talked about Dr. Christensen not reaching out to the kids to get medical information. You heard from multiple law enforcement officers, the kids wouldn't talk to him. There weren't any reports to provide because the kids didn't talk to law enforcement. You heard Dr. Christensen talk about what he did review, medical records, multiple reports. And counsel talked about some of his experts as well. And first one, Dr. Raven. What Dr. Raven talked to you about was that she reviewed a handful of documents, a handful of records that were provided to her by counsel. She didn't review a significant amount of information, but most telling maybe, she didn't even review any medical records. Dr. Marsden and Dr. Christensen reviewed medical records. They reviewed reports. They looked at the circumstances surrounding the death in reaching their conclusion. And again, they were both firm. Cause of death, asphyxiation. Manner of death, homicide. Counsel talked to you about Patrick Eller. didn't find location data for Chad. You heard from Detective Stubbs about how Chad had done searches on how to shut off location data and also at one point had cleared his location data. Chad knew how not to be found, how not to be located. Dr. Bartelink had determined that he couldn't rule out that Tylee could have been burned in 2 hours, depending on what kind of accelerant was used. And then Dr. Hampinkian, we talk about the DNA. What I'd remind you, the state talked to you about the hairs and the DNA as well. For conspiracy and for principle, there is no requirement that the defendant actually committed any physical act to end anyone's life. And counsel talked to you about coroner Dye saying Chad was kind of indifferent on the autopsy. But I would remind you that Deputy Coroner Wilmore, Samantha Gwilliam, Heather Daybell all indicated Chad told them he didn't want to get an autopsy or he wasn't going to. Steve Schultz was brought up. Counsel talked to you about how he said Chad was a good guy. I remind you, Steve Schultz is the one that after finding out there was not going to be an autopsy and how quick the funeral was, said he turned to Jason Gwilliam and said, "Do you think he killed her?" And law enforcement talked to you, several of them, Agent Hart was one, about how they did follow up on leads. And Agent Hart explained they didn't want to get blinders. So if tips came in, if it was out of the state, the FBI generally followed up on it. If it was in state, local law enforcement generally did. Tips were followed up on. This wasn't a case where law enforcement had blinders. They talked to you about that, and you heard a lot. They would go where the evidence led. Tammy was found dead in Chad's house. The kids were found dead in his yard. You go where the evidence leads. Counsel also talked to you about Chad just talking about zombies. Chad just talking about these things. Chad wasn't just talking about zombies. Chad was saying if someone was a zombie, they had to die. And people that Chad labeled zombies that were obstacles that were in his way of being with Lori or that he could get financial gain from, those were the zombies that actually died. Zombies is designated by Chad. And there was an indication that these were just messages that Chad was exchanging about people being light and dark or people's death percentages. They were just messages that resulted in 3 people dying. When we talk about whether or not there was a plan, this mission included being with him and they would progress together as translated beings. The full plan wasn't yet completely clear. Full plan to be together. Is there a perfectly orchestrated plan to take the children? Children being JJ and Tylee? Chad's response, there is a plan being orchestrated for the children. What happened to the children? They were found dead in his yard. We're so close to the finish line. What finish line? Getting rid of all earthly obstacle, all earthly relatives that were in the way of he and Lori being together. We are surrounded by celestial relatives that are simply obstacles. I want to be with you. That is my greatest hope and dream. Looks like Kauai a lot. Hopefully, we will be there someday soon together. That is the plan. And when counsel talks to you about Alex maybe going after Chad, this is in November. The picture's taken in August when Alex travels back with Chad. But remember that patriarchal blessing given in November.
Powerful goddesses were needed to be, and you progressed and were selected by the Savior himself to be part of the fourth creation. Great warriors were needed in that creation. Powerful goddesses were needed to be protected, and you were selected to help protect your sister. And you helped her in numerous probations as a defender. You have a special bond even from the premortal world. You connected there. And as she grew in power, you were right there beside her. Oh, I am Chad Daybell. It is November 24th, 2019, a Sunday afternoon, 5:15 p.m. We are going to give Alex Lamar Cox a patriarchal blessing.
Alexander Lamar.
Alexander Lamar Cox, on this special day, I lay my hands upon your head to give you a patriarchal blessing as part of the member of the Church of the Firstborn that you have earned the privilege to be a member of. You have already assisted us in ways that can never be repaid. But you will continue to do so as you move forward in this.
Alex had already helped them in ways they could never repay. Again, when there's talk of a plan, Chad talks about the perfectly orchestrated plan for the kids. He talks about the plan for he and Lori to be together unencumbered by earthly obstacles, earthly relatives. Chad says who's dark. Chad says death percentages. And 3 bodies are located in his house or on his property. 3 bodies that belong to people that were obstacles for him getting what he wanted, that were obstacles for he and Lori to end up together in Hawaii, just the 2 of them.
It's go through July 15th. So you shouldn't have any bills to worry about. Yeah, I'm not coming back. So all that stuff that's in.
That is body cam from June 9th. I think it says June 9th, 2024. That would have been June 9th of 2020. On June 9th of 2020, the bodies of Tylee Ryan and JJ Vallow were discovered on Chad's property. Chad's response, I'm not coming back. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to hold the state to our burden. Review the jury instructions. Apply your common sense. Review the testimony. Give it the weight you think it's due, the testimony and the evidence in this case. Thank you.